everyone. This is Leslie Campbell at Habitat Landscape Design, and we are teaching a class today on creating a wildlife garden. We are in partnership with Susie Peterson, who is the lead for the Backyard Habitat Certification Program. And we had a class last Wednesday, but some questions arose, and so I am re-recording in order to gather in some of the material and answer some of the questions a little bit more fully. My partner is Kira Iwasaki, and together we hope to inspire you tonight and help you with your garden making. Okay, so we're going to look through a PowerPoint here, and tonight the first thing we're going to do is provide a little bit of an overview so that we have an understanding of the ecosystem that we're in and the contributions we can make as gardeners. And then we'll launch into the design part. And I hope to give you some pro tips so that you can utilize all the information that Backyard Habitat has provided for you, but also give you a little bit more structure around the design part, kind of a guide at your side, if you will. We will make our template. So if you can grab a pencil and paper, you might want to take some notes. Otherwise, because this is recorded, you can come back to it. But we'll be emphasizing some things that will really help you get started. So the extent of the Backyard Habitat certification program is pretty far-reaching at this point. There are just under 8,000 participants, and the program reaches up into Washington and then down to kind of south to Wilsonville, and then you can see the stipple blue line over to the east and west sides as well. The program goals are mainly these 5, but tonight we're going to really focus on the native plant naturescaping because it is the use of native plants in your garden that will bring in the most wildlife. So the most important aspect of wildlife garden making is providing food. The forage that the organisms need, whether it is in the ground or all the way up to the tippy tops of your tallest tree and everything between, is critical. The organisms who live in our area rely on native plants primarily and will make use of every part of the plant. And when I say every part of the plant, sometimes we forget that a lot of things will make seeds if we can just leave the seed heads on. So that means leaving the flowers on after they've lost their color, and maybe they look a little bit woody and not as attractive as we're used to. But it is those flowers who will bring the seed. And a lot of the fruit on our shrubs and our trees, sometimes they're quite small, but they're significant in terms of supporting our wildlife. We use twigs, and if we need to cut stems down because they become a little unsightly, we encourage you to gather them into a bunch and maybe make a pile, because we have wildlife and organisms who use the hollow stems for their homes and to overwinter in particular. So native plants really do mean native food for wildlife. These organisms, whether insects or birds, have adapted to living together, so they coexist and they've co-evolved, and they really do rely on one another throughout all of our seasons for shelter and for food. And they are really running parallel lives. So when the new emerge, typically there is forage available for them, and without that forage, of course, they can't survive. Some of our native flowers have different morphology or different forms. Our insects and birds often also have different forms and are adapted to finding forage on our native plants. So here we have on the left a very flat and open structure, plant structure, and on the right the same thing applies. These are small insects with small mouth parts, and it's important for them to be able to access the nectar and the pollen easily. Alternatively, we have others that have very long tongues, like the bumblebee or like the hummingbird with a very long beak. They can get into some of our native flowers that are very long and tubular, such as this honeysuckle. On the left is the shrub honeysuckle, and on the right is our twining vine honeysuckle. The bumblebee is accessing our native huckleberry. It can get in there to the nectar. We're using its really long tongue. And then it also has the wonderful adaptation of buzz pollination. So it can shake, and you can see all the hairs on this bee. The pollen can land on the hairs and be captured and then move to another flower. Again, this is coevolution. Another really curious aspect of our wildlife is our organisms can often see ultraviolet light when we cannot. So on the left might be what we see, and on the right is when the ultraviolet light is available to organisms. Sometimes the flowers act like targets or bullseyes, and will draw them in, give them actually some direction on how to find the forage that they need, in this case, pollen and nectar. Just an example of how much more efficient our native plants are at supporting our butterflies and moths than non-natives. I'm hoping this will inspire you. So one of the things that, other than food, is water. Water is necessary in order for us to generate cells, and obviously for things like reproduction. We have many species who require water or an aquatic environment in order to reproduce, such as salamanders that lay their eggs on rotten wet wood. We have different amphibians, fish. Here, a little bath is just enough for this bird. And on a bigger scale, we are in the Pacific Flyway, and we have some very important waterways and wetlands that enable over 200 species of birds to fly through here, not only find resting spots and perches, but also food and shelter that they require. So pesticide reduction and storm water management are kind of entwined. And the reason why I say that is because if we can reduce spraying around our house, it won't run off into our tributaries or streams and creeks that then lead to our beautiful Willamette and Columbia River. So one of the goals of the Backyard Habitat Certification Program is to really pay attention to where pesticides might be used and to either reduce or eliminate them. I've noticed that a lot of people have their homes and the perimeters of their homes sprayed during winter when ants start coming in. And the problem with this is a lot of the areas under the eaves are dry and actually help some of our native bees in particular and other organisms survive throughout the winter. These dry protected areas enable the organisms to be protected. So please be mindful if you are getting frustrated, and if you need to spray, maybe do spot spraying instead. This is a study from 2008 that indicated that 63 different pesticide components are getting into the Clackamas River, just to give you an example. Within our rivers, the wider watershed is home to our native freshwater mussel species and our salmon who carry their eggs on their gills. So when we think about protecting all of this ecosystem, this regional and local ecosystem, do try to remember the biodiversity and the food chain that this area supports. It's quite significant and beautiful. And this is just an example of where it starts. It starts in your soil. So we have many beneficial insects and microorganisms that live in our soil, and they live there because there's good oxygen, there's water, and there's really good leaf litter that then gets made into soil through the action of these decomposers. I encourage you, if you can bear it, to leave your leaf litter as much as possible so that these beneficials can do their job, help our root systems and our plants, and then feed the upper parts of our food chain. This is just an example of a piece of wood that I turned over in my own garden, and you can actually see the fungus here. Lots of mutually beneficial relationships occur at the fungus and bacteria level and help the plant do the job that they need to do. Just a reminder, and I think sometimes this gets lost when we're thinking about planting, and maybe we're buying small plugs or quarts or gallons or whatever scale plant we're buying, is it is the fine roots that come off of the larger roots that actually absorb nutrition and need to be in contact with the soil. So as you're planting, this is just an example of a question that came up the other night. On the left, you can see some bark, and then to the right of the bark bed, there's some darker compost. And the reason for this is the plants that I planted on the right that are there within the darker compost were very small specimens with very shallow roots. So maybe in some of the cases, the roots extended 4 inches to 6 inches. And if I were to put bark on top of those plants, it would prevent a lot of contact between the plant roots that want to go out laterally and vertically into the soil, because the bark's just a lot thicker than a nice thin layer of compost. I like to use my leaves. On the far right picture there, you can see a colorful picture where there's some aspen leaves and some dogwood leaves. Those are great for leaf litter and for soil manufacturing. The centerpiece, there are some magnolia leaves, and like oak leaves, they have a waxy cuticle. They take longer to break down, and they can be a little bit heavier. So I like to use those in areas as a weed barrier, and also a place where maybe I have established shrubs and they don't really need to have the finer layer. They can actually cope because they're established with a thick layer of either the waxy leaves or the bark and the chips. Some of you had successfully removed turf, and now we're at a point where you weren't sure if you were going to get to planting this winter. So we suggested covering it with cardboard or plastic or something that would disable the ability of light to go in and restart the grass. Any amount of light will initiate growth. Another option is to overseed with something like clover. So this is the time to put out some wildflower seeds as well as a cover crop. And I would encourage you to consider this as an option. Shelter. Some of the larger openings in snags or felled logs, you know, it can be pretty obvious that there are organisms living here and using these areas for shelter. And sometimes it's not so obvious, as in this micro shelter, I'll call it, which is a stem from one of our native plants, and a mason bee made its homes, laid its eggs within this beautiful stem. The yellow is pollen, and the brown is the mud that the bee would have used to make the individual cells. And when these bees emerge, they utilize the pollen as an energy source, and then they break through that soil layer. It's really fascinating. If you haven't tried keeping mason bees, I encourage it. It's a science experiment. And then on the larger pieces of wood, such as this tree, some of the smaller birds will actually nest in these holes, but also get between some of the openings that exist behind the bark. And then, of course, there's plenty of insects available for birds and for other organisms who like to eat that as a protein. So now that we know something about what it takes to encourage wildlife and keep wildlife in our garden, let's move on to the design part. We can go from something like this, which doesn't really house too many organisms, to something like this. And what I like about this picture is it emphasizes grasses, but also it's extremely densely planted, which operates a system whereby there's conductivity. So there's a lot of wildlife corridors in here. There would likely be ground nesting bees and ground nesting birds. It is shelter because it is so dense. So when we think about planting, let's encourage density and really cramming flowers in. But where to start? So we have a very good idea about our land, and hopefully by now we've noticed where there might be some dry spaces, maybe some wet spaces, maybe we know where the sun is and where the shade is. So let's get a piece of paper out and jot that down, but let's also pay attention to what we want as humans. So it is our habitat as well. Do we want vegetable beds? Do we want to dine outside? Do we want to have some more paths or maybe a pet run? Good to know all these things. Do we need privacy? Privacy is a really big deal for a lot of people. We live in an urban setting, most of us, and sometimes we want to have a wildlife garden, but we think, oh, do I have enough space? And the fact of the matter is once we start taking that turf out, we end up with a lot more space. This is an example of a person who wanted privacy. They also had a very heavy fir tree in the background that they knew, unfortunately, was so dense and so heavy. And although it created some privacy, it also created really heavy dark shade. So they limbed up the fir tree a bit. Selective pruning is what we call it. And they put in a screen, a really pretty fence, but you can see it has openings to let light through. And it's also very attractive. It's ornamental. They wanted to get rid of the turf and have plants that would give them a depth of privacy. So this is probably about 16 feet worth of densely planted shrubbery. It's quite beautiful. There are evergreen huckleberry mixed in with Acer circinatum, which is our small vine maple, and other things. They also wanted a hammock. So in the background, you can see there's some Gualtheria, which is evergreen. There's some lovely ferns and thimbleberry. We do have some evergreen materials that are really handy to use if you need more privacy. But it's nice to have all of the deciduous materials and change it up for fruiting and for berries and flowers. If you have space and are interested in a pond, one thing that's really critical to know is if you want life in the pond, so for instance, dragonflies or salamanders, frogs, visitors like ducks and things, you'll want to situate the pond in an area that has at least 5 hours of sunshine so that the photosynthesis can occur and it can be a healthy pond for plant life and for animal life. It also has to have a slope because we want for the organisms that need to crawl, the crawlers, to be able to access the water and also their habitat for reproduction. If the sides are vertical or too abrupt, they won't be able to access the pond. Now, some of the decision making can be difficult. How much turf to remove? Do we take it all out? where do we want to have beds versus sitting areas. And the most helpful thing I can suggest is to actually get your hose out, move it around, use it as though it was a border or a boundary, and have some chairs out there and situate them in a way that feels good to you, maybe gives you the views that you prefer. This is a great way to ascertain how deep you want your beds and how much privacy you might need. When you begin to draw out your garden, it's going to be messy. And it starts with ideas, moves to different types of sketches, and of course you'll have discussions, and then you refine. One of the first steps I like to use is just identifying the things that will not change. For instance, where is the location of the house, the entrance to the property, any paths that will remain. And then identify where the sun is, where you're going to have your sunniest spots, the shadiest spots, the dry spots, the moist spots. And the reason why you want to understand your soil is because the plants that you plant in those different areas will be dependent upon whatever soil and sun is existing in that spot. And so there are different categories. So this will help you identify when it's time to buy plants, how many plants you need and for what space. You get a little bit further into it. If you need a privacy screen, you might decide you want to put in an evergreen tree or maybe an evergreen or mixed hedgerow. You might like to have a deciduous tree for color and for just movement, different things. I like to color code my design so I have a sense of where the sunny plants are going to go versus the shady. And then what's really helpful is once you've identified the different types of areas that you have and color code them, you can measure how big they are and start deciding which plants you want, which is the fun part. On turf removal, just briefly, a lot of us are interested in removing turf and need some guidance. These people used a really clever way of deciding where do they want beds versus where do they want turf. And they're using their turf in this case as a pathway down to the gate that is below. And they have put, I'm not really sure why they've kept the stakes there, but I think it's a nice way to indicate where the plants will go, or within which space the plants will go, I should say. I think the easiest and least expensive way to handle getting rid of your turf is by getting cardboard and laying it out for a winter. As long as there's no light, you will not get continued growth. Some people use black plastic, which can be kind of expensive, but that's effective too. The person on the right is doing a solarization, which is in the heat of summer, if you put plastic down, you can really kill the lawn by kind of baking it. I personally have used a lot of cardboard, and then after the turf was dead in spring, before the grass started initiating growth again, I used a sod cutter to remove it because my roots had been established for quite a long time. Some of the roots went down 18 inches and I wanted to be sure it was gone. Invasive weed removal while you're preparing, it's a really important idea to grub out areas where you have either really aggressive plants or you have invasives like the ivy. And when I say grub out, I mean use that tonged fork tool and really get the roots out. So we get to have fun. Now we get to choose the plants for the different areas in our garden. And One of my favorite resources to go to for inspiration, but also just organizing which plants I'm going to buy, is the Sparrowhawk native plant site. So Nikki West started this. She had been running the Backyard Habitat program before Susie and learned a lot. Her photographs of the plants are beautiful. The information that she provides is fantastic and accurate. But what I really like about it too is you can search by category. So you can, for instance, look for plants that grow in the sun, in dry soil, sun, moist, those sorts of things. So it's a very helpful site. The Portland Plant List is also a really amazing document. And I know that it is embedded within the Backyard Habitat Certification Program website, but it talks a little bit more about how to choose your plants and the plant communities. And it also talks a little bit about succession, which is a really important aspect of the garden that we'll get to in just a moment. As we're choosing plants, what we really want to know is that because these organisms, whether they are insects or birds, they have learned to coexist and they have co-evolved. So they actually can utilize different spaces within your garden as long as you provide those spaces. This is a really neat picture. It's out of one of my very, very favorite books. And if you can get your hands on it, I highly recommend it. It has everything you'll ever want to know about wildlife gardening. It's Russell Link's book entitled Landscaping for Wildlife in the Pacific Northwest. Copyright 1999. I don't know if there were other editions, but well worth your search. What he's showing us here is the different birds that live at different levels within a native landscape. You have everything at the ground level all the way up. And you can also see that there are shrubs and underplantings here, but really the picture, what I want it to convey mostly to you is how densely planted this space is. And the reason for that is because you can get more wildlife with more diversity. Remember, of course, that they want to have forage and they also want to have shelter. And when we plant very densely, we are enabling wildlife corridors, so safe ways to connect across a space. Through the Backyard Habitat Wildlife Program, what we see is one neighbor will connect to another neighbor and another neighbor. So this is giving us a huge amount of connectivity and support for the organisms. In the back of my website, Habitat Landscape Design, which is www.habitatdesignpdx.com, there are some free resources. There is a wildlife garden making guide that offers some free templates. People have found this to be very useful in getting maybe their first groupings of plants organized and purchased. Native ground cover is really important because we really want to cover the ground so that we don't get weed seed. We want it to be densely planted. We also enjoy the rooting systems of all these ground covers because they prevent erosion and obviously bind the soil, but also give us soil health. Something that we can do in Portland, often we'll have a really wide parking strip. I like reflecting whatever's going on in the main garden in the parking strip as well. Evergreen materials like the sword fern look good all year round, are really lovely. We have some really nice small shade trees that can be planted above them. Anyway, I encourage connectivity and repetition. Our evergreen huckleberry is a wonderful plant. Here we have a few others. As for sunny beds, many of us are interested in pollination and pollinators. And the good news is we have a combination of types of growing now that's become very popular. So Meadowscaping is something that a lot of people are really enjoying. They can get seed now and overseed a garden, maybe that they've started out with, some quart-sized plants and they still have some bare spaces. Well, this is a really good time to overseed with wildflower mixes. And there are a number of resources. Steel Acres, STEELE Acres, over in Washington, can provide you with wonderful seeds, as can ProTime Lawn Mix. If you have a lawn that wants to start changing into a meadow, or you want some pollination flowers in there, they're a great resource on Ankeny in Portland. This garden is very modern. It has a distinct style with that formium. And we're not extremists here, so we encourage people to bring in other drought-tolerant type plants with our natives. This is a hot spot next to an asphalt street that faces south, so it's about as hot and as extreme as it can be in Portland. We have a wonderful sambucus and elderberry there on the left. We have manzanita. We have Cercis canadensis, which is a lovely small tree in the background there on the right. Arbutus unido is the strawberry bush or tree is in the background, makes a lovely evergreen privacy hedge. So do feel free to mix it up, but do notice also how densely planted this garden is. It's a very robust wildlife garden. It has many layers. It's not a big space, and I think it's quite lovely and appealing. Again, a free template in the Wildlife Resource Guide. Native water garden planting is a really beautiful, kind of specialized way of bringing in wildlife. This is from a pond that I had at my home. And you can get all these plants at Hughes Water Gardens, and a lot of guidance and materials for do-it-yourselfers. If you're not familiar with that yet, I encourage you to go for a visit. It's really fun. Hughes Water Gardens. I believe it's in Wilsonville. Okay, so we're ready to plant. We've pulled our turf up and we've gotten all of our friends to help us, which is really critical here because there were 10 of us on this planting. And it does take a lot of work. We couldn't get to all of it, so you can see some of the open soil still has the plastic on it. Absolutely fine. We don't want weed seeds to get in. We like to place the plants so that the trees and the shrubs go in first, so the biggest material, and then the smaller things around them, and then of course overseeding if you plan on doing that. It's a great way to save money. Remember to refer to your map over and over again of, where's the sun? When we think about sun, we really want to consider when it is highest in the sky at the end of June. The sunny spots will be places where the sun shines maybe, 5 hours a day to 7 hours. And then as the season changes, you'll notice, that it's going to get more shady as the sun lowers. That's okay. And soil. If you have very dry soil, there are certain plants that can take drought-tolerant conditions. Every garden needs to be irrigated, and we recommend that you irrigate for 3 years. And the reason for that is the first year is just, the plant settling in, it's making some roots. We call that sleep. And then the roots find the soil and they start moving out the second year. That's called creep. And the third year is when they really start taking off. They leap. Sleep, creep, leap. If you can plant in groupings, that's best because these are small organisms, some of them, and they don't have much energy. So they really want to keep their energy resource very efficient, very effective as they move around the garden. If you can cram in 3 or 5 or 7 or more of the same plant, it gives them an opportunity to go from flower head to flower head, say, for example, for their nectar or their pollen, and not exert a lot of energy to have to do it. And chances are then they will go back and nest or lay their eggs somewhere close to the grouping. So do consider repeating groupings and having groupings of 3, 5, 7 or more. And I like odd numbers. It looks really nice. Here is a really thin strip between a hot sidewalk and a little bark path. I thought this was quite beautiful. They've kept it very simple. They have a yarrow, which is the white material, and then a solidago. What I like about this is the yarrow is a repeat bloomer, and it comes in really pretty early in the bloom season. And then the solidago carries over into fall. And if you're lucky with the solidago and you leave the flowers on, it will go to seed, which is really great. On the right, there's some wonderful plants. We do want to make sure that we plant the correct milkweed. And this is a crocosmia, which is not native, but it's beautiful and it provides a lot of nectar for the hummingbirds. When you are planting, do plant to the mature size. And the reason for this is we don't want the plants to necessarily compete for the soil nutrition or their needs, water needs. Sometimes we'll come across a beautiful plant in a nursery and forget to see, the tag that says it's going to be 12 feet high and wide. And then we end up having to either remove plants or they die because they just can't outcompete something that is going to be that large and take over not only their sun resource, but also their water and nutritional resource from the soil. We also really want to emphasize succession planting, which means a constant bloom time in your garden. So very early spring, we see the hummingbirds emerge. They are feeding their young. They need that nectar source to survive. And this ribes is one of the very first blooming plants. It's extraordinary. It has a long bloom time and really can't get enough of this particular plant, but we'll want to plant for all seasons. So the camas here that's up in the right-hand corner is a wetland plant typically, but it blooms really early and it's fabulous for bumblebees. The checker mallow is something that comes a little bit after that and lasts for quite a long time. And then of course the echinacea at the bottom there, it has not only a gorgeous nectar source and pollen, but seeds into the winter. So we want to get the most bang for our buck. A great resource that can inform you really well about the seasons and the months that these different native plants bloom and can provide for us is in the West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District website. If you Google the pollinator plants and bloom periods table, that should pop up for you. Another great resource is through Xerces Society, which is the Society for Conservation of Invertebrates. This has a little bit more information, which is really fun and also very, very, very helpful. This is a very densely planted perennial bed, and I just think it's quite beautiful, and I'm hoping that it will inspire you. So just as a reminder, if you have some existing formal plants or non-native plants, please incorporate them. They don't have to go away. And often our more conventional gardens are not as kind of woolly and wild looking. I implore you to think a little bit more wild-like and cram in as many plants as you can for that type of succession planting. It offers something that is different, but can be very, very beautiful structurally. And then when you start seeing that wildlife come into your garden, it's extremely gratifying. So thank you for all this time. I hope this has been helpful. If you have questions, please do reach out to Susie at the Backyard Habitat Wildlife Program. I should say Backyard Habitat Program. And you can certainly send any questions to us at contact@habitatdesignpdx.com. Do look at our resource page. We do have a lot of freebies that I think would be very helpful. Thank you very much. Happy gardening.